civilizations appeared on our continent, flourished and grew during the 3rd millennium BC on the islands and along the coastline of the Aegean Sea, from which they get their name, the Aegean civilizations.
The Cycladic civilization was particularly developed. It was born in the Cyclades, islands that got their name from the fact they formed a kind of circle, Kyklos in Greek, around the island of Delos, mythical birthplace of Apollo. Around 2,500 years before Christ, the inhabitants of the Cyclades already dominated the Aegean Sea and distinguished themselves for their artifacts and products. This was the Neolithic Age, the New Stone Age, marked by the appearance of utensils made out of sharpened, not chipped stone, as in the previous Paleolithic Age. The Cycladic civilization also produced the first examples of ceramics.
Among the most famous crafts produced during this period were the statuettes made out of Parian marble and coming from the island of Paros, home, later on, to greatest masterpieces of classical sculpture. The statuettes often represented the Earth Mother Goddess, supreme divinity of all Mediterranean cultures. She granted fertility and had power over life and death. Several examples are preserved in the National Museum in Athens. The figurative art of the Cyclades Islands reached its height in the celebrated statue of the lyre player, which is also found in the National Museum in Athens. In a harmonic play of volumes, the sculptor reduces everything to a simple cylindrical shape. He appears to anticipate several modern works of art by 4,000 years, works like these by Fernand Léger.
Aside from its artistic prowess, the importance of the Cycladic culture lies in the fact that it laid the basis on which one of the greatest civilizations of European proto-history would take root, grow, and flourish, the Cretan civilization.
The man who discovered it was Sir Arthur Evans when he began excavating on the island of Crete in 1900. He called it the Minoan civilization, after Minos, the mythical king of Crete.
The first phase of the Cretan civilization is called the pre-palatial phase and dates to between 3000 and 2100 BC. Its beginnings are marked by the arrival on the island of peoples coming from Anatolia. This period still bears traces of the Neolithic Age, as we see in these statuettes that are preserved in the Archaeological Museum at Heraklion. In them, the rigid, formal style of the Cycladic figures is enriched thanks to an artistic effort to give greater resonance to the plastic quality of the human body. The libation vases in terracotta are especially interesting. They depict sacred animals, like the bull, which also appears with acrobats clinging to its horns.
Vase art plays a vitally important role in the evolution of the Cretan civilization. These vases of the pre-palatial era have been made by hand and fired in the open. They are decorated with carved geometric designs. In some of these examples, the non-homogeneous baking of the terracotta has produced purely casual chromatic effects, which are the result of the clay coming in contact with the fire.
The success of these artifacts is demonstrated by the so-called Vasiliki vases that got their name from an area in the middle of the island and where many of them have been found. But the most significant fact in the history of Cretan ceramics is represented by the appearance, in the Middle Minoan age, of the most effectively decorated works in the entire ancient world, the Kamares style. These were initially discovered near the town of Kamares in the caves of Mount Ida, where, according to Greek mythology, Zeus was brought up. They were exported everywhere as far as Egypt and the Syrian-Palestinian coast.
The Kamares vases denote a constant search for harmony between the form of the container and its decoration, achieved using surprising and precious chromatic effects. When dealing with figurative themes like vegetation and marine fauna, the decorative elements predominate. It's tempting to imagine that some of these objects adorned the king's table, like this large vase that looks like a fruit bowl, and that was found at Festos. Or this crater bowl decorated with flowers in relief.
Another important activity that characterized the first period of the Cretan civilization was metalworking. It was in the pre-palatial age that tin and the first bronze alloys began to be used on the island. Silver was added to these later on. The objects preserved in the Museum of Heraklion were found mostly in tombs, and they illustrate the high level of technique the Cretan craftsmen had reached by the end of the 3rd millennium BC.
Some of these objects have deep symbolic value, like the double axe, called a labrys, which represented political and religious power wielded by the king.
The use of metal developed greatly in the field of weapon making, which was one of the most celebrated activities of the Minoan civilization. These swords are examples of their extensive production. Not only are they especially large, but they are so perfectly hammered that they have retained much of their elasticity, even after 4,000 years.
The work of goldsmiths also flourished in the Cretan civilization. During the pre-palatial period from 2100 to 1700 BC, gold was embossed, linked, beaten and worked using the fine granulation technique, as can be seen in this famous pendant depicting 2 bees on a drop of honey. Different types of jewelry were produced, from earrings and bracelets to rings and diadems, amazingly thin chains, gold necklaces with embossed or beaten elements, or decorated with precious stones like amethyst, onyx, sardonyx and rock crystal.
The finest expression of the Minoan civilization can be admired in its architecture, and specifically in its palatial architecture, as we see in the remains of the palace of Malea. Architecture of this kind flourished for the first time in Europe here on Crete 4,000 years ago, in the palaces of what Homer described as the island of the 100 cities. These are the ruins of the palace of Gurnia. This is the period known as the First Palaces, when building developed from being an immediate response to people's need for a simple living space to a style that could satisfy the refined tastes of kings. The remains of the palace of Phaistos may appear unimpressive, yet they are the oldest architectural examples in Western culture.
Here, for the first time on our continent, architecture assumed its true artistic significance in terms of its ability to organize spaces according to functional and aesthetic needs and in harmony with its surroundings.
Excavations and restoration work carried out by an Italian archaeological mission in the early 1900s brought to light 3 building phases of the first palace. The remains we see today refer to the 3rd phase, when the palace was built on a new level after filling the lower level with lime and mud mixed with broken stones and other bits and pieces. Storerooms, where several pithoi or jars have been unearthed, were part of the first phase on the ground floor.
The facade was set back, which gave it an imposing appearance, thanks also to a vast paved courtyard in the area in front of it. This area must have been used for performances and ritual representations, which the public could watch from the broad rows of steps. With the central area, this was probably the first example of a theatre on the European continent. The theatre was connected to the palace via a monumental staircase, as we can see in this hypothetical reconstruction.
3 centuries later, this area, destined for shows, assumed a more organic and rational appearance, as in the famous theatre of Knossos, mentioned by Homer. Sacred dances, in which the Cretans apparently excelled, were performed here. The royal box stood at the culminating point of the staircase.
The theatre of Knossos is different from that of Phaistos, insofar as the architect makes use of the natural conformation of the ground, thus anticipating the concept of the Greek theatre.
In 1700 BC, a natural disaster, probably an earthquake, devastated the cities on the island and destroyed the first palaces of Phaistos and Knossos. The catastrophe dictated a pause in the history of the Minoan culture, but it did not interrupt its development. On the contrary, it became an opportunity to renew its artistic progress. Knossos became the political center of the island. Its king annihilated the city of Malea and forced the king of Phaistos to recognize his sovereignty. He built a network of roads to reinforce his hegemony. These extend across Crete, the islands, and along the coastline of the Aegean Sea.
Commercial trade with Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor intensified. Minoan produce spread throughout the eastern and central Mediterranean as far as the coasts of the Black Sea, Sicily, and, according to some, even as far as Britain. These products included vases made out of stone, marble, and alabaster, of which we see some examples in the Museum of Heraklion. This particularly beautiful vase with decorations in relief is the famous Vase of the Reapers.
At the height of their power, the kings built one of the most famous architectonic complexes of all time and of all civilizations, the palace at Knossos. Its vast proportions, the complexity of its quarters, and the distribution of its rooms has given it the name the City Palace. According to legend, it was designed by Daedalus, the architect of Minos. It extends over an area of 20,000 square meters. It included over 1,300 rooms distributed in some places on over 5 floors.
In the eyes of the Greeks, this palace, with its 1,000 halls and corridors, appeared so amazing that it gave rise to the legend of the labyrinth. This tells the tale of the Minotaur, killed by Theseus and born from the monstrous love between Queen Pasiphae and the sacred bull. It tells of Daedalus, the brilliant architect of the labyrinth, who, together with his son, needed to escape from the prison he himself had constructed. For this purpose he made 2 wonderful wings of wax, which melted when the ambitious Icarus flew too close to the sun and left his poor father on the coast of Sicily.
The Palace of Knossos rises on the top of a hill to the right of the river Kairatos, which flows into the Aegean near Amnisos, the ancient port of Knossos, which Homer mentions in his Odyssey. The absence of fortifications around the palace confirms not only the peaceful character of its sovereigns, but also their absolute power over the island and the surrounding seas, which they dominated with their fleets. The complex was protected by simple walls, guarded by small towers and guard posts. Here we see the remains of the East Bastion. The entrances stood on the north, west, and south sides. The north gate is situated along the ramp that leads to the harbour road. The narrow passage is dominated by 2 protruding balconies. The western one has been partially reconstructed. This is what the entrance must have looked like at the time. Beside the north gate is an open area known as the initiation area, with a fountain for making ritual purification ablutions.
In the Minoan world, there was no such thing as a temple as such. There were altars erected in places where people thought the gods might congregate, like inside a cave, or on the top of a mountain, or in the heart of a forest. The palace where the chief priest resided was also used as a sanctuary.
On the west side of the palace, a vast courtyard, paved with large marble paving stones, was used for religious ceremonies. 2 column bases, dating back to 2000 BC, and 3 votive wells appear to confirm this theory. This vast courtyard led via the long processional corridor thus named because of its richly decorative frescoes to the main entrance. This was commonly known as the Great Propylaeon, because of its similarity with future similar Greek designs and monumental entranceways. This is where the pictorial cycle that accompanied guests along the entire processional corridor concluded. The monumental entrance led to the sanctuary of the 3 columns, which also comprised the treasury hall. The sanctuary complex included huge storerooms filled with foodstuffs, which were also considered part of the state treasury.
Money wasn't yet used during the Minoan age. The barter system was employed, which involved the exchange of oil, wine, and grain.
Finally, the south entrance. This opened onto the King's Corridor, so called for the famous wall decorations which Sir Evans dubbed the King of Lilies, or the Priest King. This corridor led to the great central courtyard of the palace, where the daring and dangerous taurokatapsiae were held. These were performances involving bulls and had definite religious connotations.
These performances recall the legendary tribute of 7 young men and 7 young virgins that the Greeks had to pay as tribute to the powerful King Minos.
The royal apartments were arranged around this vast courtyard. These included meeting halls, rooms for religious functions, and a series of administrative rooms. There were mills, cellars, workshops for palace craftsmen, including goldsmiths, potters, engravers, painters, and artists, as well as the living quarters for them and their families.
The palace was much more than just a residence for the king and a sanctuary. It was also a commercial and production centre, which explains the term city palace used to describe the complex. We find similar, modified versions of this kind of architectonic structure in our monastery complexes of the Middle Ages. These too were like small cities that intended being economically self-sufficient. Many monasteries are similar to the city palace, with their various rooms, aside from the central courtyard or cloister and dormitories. There was the refectory and workshops where all kinds of arts and crafts were practiced.
Among the reception rooms that give onto the central courtyard, the throne room of Minos is particularly interesting. It was almost completely reconstructed by Evans. It comprises 2 rooms, a waiting room or antechamera, where ambassadors and guests performed ritual ablutions before being brought into the presence of the sovereign, and the throne room itself. Rows of seating lined the sides of the room like a crown around the throne. These were originally made out of alabaster.
The fountain nearby suggests that the throne room was used for religious ceremonies as well, which would confirm the theory that the king was both supreme political and religious leader.
In the living quarters, the most characteristic rooms are those called the Megaron Polytiron and the Room of the Double Axe. Both rooms are preceded by an elegant portico that runs along 2 sides and that serve to attenuate the glaring subtropical island sun and to offer a protected area for walking or relaxing. Inside, there are two large rooms separated by a series of doors, which, when opened, created one large space.
The room of the double axe got its name from the decoration on the wall above the throne, which depicts a labrys, or double axe.
Light enters the first room through the outside portico, while the inner room is immersed in shadow and lit by a small courtyard. In this way, in summer, the light was filtered through the two courtyards, while the heat was tempered by drafts of air created by the two opposing porticos. In winter, the rooms could be kept warm by closing the doors and heating the interior with simple braziers.
All the rooms where the sovereign administered public affairs had seats with backrests. In the proto-historical world, this symbolized divine power and as such was limited to the sovereign himself. This is what remains of one of the chalky alabaster thrones.
Beside the bedroom, or megaron, of the king was that of the queen. The architectural style is essentially the same. Functional and spatial requirements had to meet the refined tastes of a highly evolved society and found aesthetic expression through the genius of the architect. Beside the Queen's bedroom is a small bathroom, complete with bath in terracotta.
The articulated variations between corridors and courtyards, illumination shafts and stairwells, open and closed areas, brightly lit and shadowy areas, all of this creates an interlocking, complementary effect in this complex, which is further reinforced by the various levels on which it was built.
This stairway originally linked the floors on this part of the building and is made of simple ramps that skirt an illumination shaft. It's an architectural solution we still use today in modern buildings 35 centuries later. On every landing, there was a broad veranda on which a guard could keep check on the entrances to the various apartments. The frescoes decorating the walls are especially interesting. On them, we see reproduced the characteristic shields, shaped like figure eights, that were used by the Cretans. Another richly decorated guard post protected the entrance to the Queen's private apartments, which lay on the northwest side of the palace complex. They were directly above the throne room. An illumination shaft allowed light in upon the fountain below.
Minoan architecture is marked by the harmonic relationship created between the building and the natural environment in which it finds itself. The facades are broken up as though the architect wanted to avoid straight lines and symmetry in order to have the building blend in with its surroundings. This is completely different from the absolute symmetry proposed by Egyptian architectural models or the ideal balance of Greek structures. Minoan architecture seems more intent on reflecting the autonomous and spontaneous flow of nature, which is why it articulates itself in such a free and picturesque manner. The static and solemn architecture of the Mediterranean cultures of Egypt and Mesopotamia finds its opposite in the dynamic and light-filled style of Knossos.
The pictorial effect of these grandiose architectonic complexes was accentuated by the decor, both inside and outside. The characteristic columns, carved in various shapes and forms, were stuccoed and painted in bright colours. Floors were paved with chalky alabaster, which is shinier than ordinary alabaster. They mixed this with red glazing and finished off the edges in black or green. Walls were covered with precious stuccos or plastered over and decorated with frescoes. When the fresco covered the entire wall, figurative themes were preferred. Artists took their inspiration mostly from nature, which they depicted with energy and freshness. Where human figures are represented, they're usually involved in some joyful scenario or palace ceremony. White is used for women's skin, red for men's. Human figures are depicted with great vivacity and often in miniature.
Together with its architectural style, fresco was one of the great revelations of Cretan art. This kind of art reflects a dignified civilization where women played an important role, where the court was refined, lively and sophisticated. Bejeweled women are depicted wearing finely embroidered clothes and complicated hairstyles. Their poses are natural and graceful. This figure is especially famous. Evans called her the Belle Parisienne because of her coquettish looks.
This is another fresco that displays extraordinary artistry. 3 acrobats perform with a bull. These performances concluded the religious ceremonies that took place in the great courtyard of the palace. Acrobats performing with bulls is a subject we find in sculpture as well. Here's one done in ivory. The paintings on the celebrated sarcophagus of the Agia Triada, or Holy Trinity, are also fascinating and very probably belonged to a member of the royal family. They represent religious functions and funerary symbols, like the offering of a libation. On the side are depicted winged chariots, one pulled by griffins and belonging to the gods, the other pulled by horses and belonging to the deceased. On Santorini, in the ancient city of Thera, some of the most significant examples of Cretan figurative art have come to light. These are the frescoes of Akrotiri, preserved today in the National Archaeological Museum of Athens. Excavation done in 1967 on a site on the Acropolis of Thera revealed how this city was the best known and most evolved in the Minoan world outside of Crete. Some of these frescoes represent decorative cycles. This one depicts a naval expedition and extends for over 5 meters. It's proof of Crete's maritime power and prowess.
In these frescoes, Cretan art expresses its elegance. Whether it deals with animals or natural subjects, it's always joyfully creative. The artists multiplied decorative effects and inventions, like in the fresco of the antelopes, or in the one where the king exercises himself by boxing.
The conclusion is that the Cretans, whom many experts consider the first European nation, created a joyful civilization. They were lovers of pleasure, healthy and sophisticated, prosperous and self-assured. A civilization born in a peaceful and hard-working environment, based on deep religious feeling and boundless love of nature.
In this ideal atmosphere, the Cretan artist could explore the secret beauties of life and express the intimate world of nature through the multiple forms of art.
Divinities like the famous serpent goddess, the Cretan representation of the earth goddess, are always depicted in a lively, refined and vigorous manner.
Aside from their religious dimension, these figures are presented like noble ladies of the court, dressed in the typical Minoan fashion. In their naturalness and grace, they represent the finest examples of Minoan artistic expression.
Unfortunately, every civilization has its moment of tragedy and decline, the final catastrophe, and then oblivion. So it was with Crete. Around 1450 BC, the warlike nations of Mycenae reached the island from the continent. They invaded it and destroyed its main cities. They enslaved its people and extinguished what remains one of the most fascinating civilizations ever to appear on the European continent.